Man who is a doctor, a cardiologist, a public health campaigner, Dr Aseem Malhotra, are you there? Because by God, have we got questions for you.
Great to meet you again, Russell.
Do you know that I love you?
I do. I love you too, mate.
You can feel it in your heart. Okay, so listen, you've recently released a paper. It's controversial, so I'll be pressing this a lot. Allegedly. And occasionally this. Just to lighten the mood. But what is it that's been revealed through your papers? Exploration.
So Russell, these are papers, two papers published in the International Journal of Insulin Resistance, peer-reviewed. Essentially, I spent about 9 months critically appraising the data on the mRNA vaccine, specifically Pfizer's vaccine, to look at the benefit and harms and what the implications were from those results in terms of how we move forward in the management of COVID-19. And to conclude, essentially, what I found is that, which is not news for many people, there was a clear lack of informed consent when it came to the administration of the vaccine. But when one breaks down the data, certainly now you have to vaccinate several thousand people to prevent one COVID death, and that's likely best case scenario. But the absolute risk of harm is actually unprecedented in the history of medicine. So we're talking about harms of at least 1 in 800 to 1 in 1,000 of a serious adverse event occurring. Now, what that means is, Russell, I think anyone looking at that data, which for me is unequivocal, it suggests, and what I concluded from my paper, that the COVID mRNA vaccines need to be suspended, paused, or whatever you want to say, withdrawn, until a full investigation is launched into Pfizer's original trial, getting access to the raw data, and also analyzing properly what we call pharmacovigilance data, so real-world data around the reporting of adverse events, which I've said already is unprecedented.
That's fantastic. Can you tell me how big a sample size you're talking about? Like, what underwrites these claims?
Well, when in evidence-based medicine, when you look at data, you have to look at the quality of the study. So if we start first and foremost, I'm glad it's already been mentioned a few times. If you go back to Pfizer's original trial, there was a reanalysis done by independent researchers, very eminent scientists from University of Stanford, Robert Kaplan, Associate Editor of the BMJ, Peter Doshi, and Joseph Freeman, who's a lead author who I've spoken to directly on his findings. And they looked into the original trials of Moderna and Pfizer. And by the way, Russell, why this is important is this is what we call the gold standard of evidence-based medicine, randomized controlled trials. It was these studies alone that led to the rollout of the vaccine, the approval of the vaccine, and even the coercion and mandates for the vaccine. So what those original findings concluded independently, and which I'm about to tell you, is crucial to the whole narrative now as we move forward. And they found, and this was published in the peer-reviewed journal Vaccine, one of the premier vaccine journals in the world, only a few weeks ago. For me, it's a smoking gun. They found that the original trial suggested that one was more likely to suffer a serious adverse event from taking the vaccine than one was to be hospitalized with COVID. And this is also during the original Wuhan strain, if you remember, Russell, which was far more lethal. So it suggests certainly quite strongly that even at the beginning, it was likely that the vaccine was going to do more harm than good for most people. And I find it very hard to believe that the Pfizer scientists didn't know that. And it may well be that's why Pfizer was so keen to get indemnification across the world from several governments against being liable for vaccine injury. And one of the biggest, sort of largest democracy country in the world, if you like, actually said no, and that was India. India refused for that indemnification because they thought, well, if there are going to be serious vaccine injuries, the government is then going to be liable. And that's really the situation we're in. So as far as quality of data is concerned, it's the highest quality data. And given that risk of serious adverse events, which is likely at least 1 in 800, then for me, it's a no-brainer. It needs to be paused and it needs to be an investigation immediately.
It seems to me, Doctor, that to admit a transgression on this scale would be so disruptive, so expensive, such a sort of a dissolution of the assumptions that we lived with for that 2-year period, that it's kind of an insurmountable barrier, really. Do you not feel that ultimately what will happen is that you'll be marginalised and maligned, and these findings will be buried. You can't admit this. It's too heavy, isn't it?
No, it's a great point, Russell. So I thought about this in a lot of depth even before I published this. I was interviewed by Robert Kennedy only last week, and he said, "Isn't this career suicide?" He was very supportive of my findings. But the reality is this, for me personally, first and foremost, I cannot continue in my good conscience as a doctor, as a public health campaigner, without exposing this truth. And Russell, this isn't an anomaly. I mean, it's something you've highlighted brilliantly. For the last several months, I've been watching your videos. I've been watching the way you get into a lot of detail and depth around the ultimate causes of what is a detriment to people's well-being, which is the fact that democracy is under attack. So this is not an anomaly. I for the last sort of 10 years have campaigned on increasing transparency in medicine. And on 3 occasions, Russell, I've even called for a public inquiry through different media outlets, The Guardian, the Daily Mail, The Eye, saying that we need an inquiry into the pharmaceutical industry and how research is disseminated on a...
Dr. Aseem Malhotra, I did have to use the magical doctor's finger there to get a little word in edgeways. I did have to part the cheeks and see what was going on. I'd like I'm watching the chat. People are really into what we're talking about, and I think that we need to give them access to that entire paper so that people can look at it for themselves. A lot of people are asking for your name again. You can find that. We'll put out a link. It's Dr. Aseem Malhotra. I hope I'm correctly pronouncing it. And I would say, what are the next steps that we can take? Are you saying that people should, obviously you're saying no one should get any more COVID boosters, and that it's the role of the media now to start publicising this new data. Do you think that there's any chance of the kind of transparency that's required?
Russell, I think there is. And of course, part of it is through social media and the dissemination of knowledge to the masses. And your platform is certainly aiding that in a big way. I've seen a huge change. The papers were published a couple of weeks ago in the Journal of Insulin Resistance. It's open access, it's free. I've had amazing feedback, phenomenal feedback from doctors. I've had no serious rebuttals to the paper. There have been a few blogs, a few character assassination type of stuff, which I'm sure you've been used to many times in your career, but they're not addressing the main concerns. No one is rebutting any of the clear facts. And certainly, as a cardiologist, the reason I looked at this in the first place is one of the most common side effects or concerns of the mRNA vaccines are cardiovascular, myocarditis, cardiac arrest, heart attacks. And the data that suggests that is very, very good quality data. So for me, the way we move forward is through this continued dissemination for the public to become aware. But I'm not somebody that is just going to, write a paper and then sit back. I will push this and campaign on this issue as long as I can. In fact, next week, towards the end of next week, I'm actually speaking the British Parliament to MPs in an APPG meeting organised by Sir Christopher Chope to actually present data to MPs to say the conclusions are very clear. We need to suspend the vaccine. Now, one thing, I know, Russell, you don't want me to go on too much, but one thing I think is important to reassure the public.
We've had to invent a whole little system. We had to invent a little finger system to keep you under some sort of form of control. I wish there was a vaccine to make you speak in shorter sentences. I'd give you that little jab myself, and the adverse reactions would be what? I don't know. Now, listen, it's fantastic, and I want you to come regularly on our show to continually update us. But listen, let me tell you that the Gates Foundation has boosted, the interesting use of word, its funding for digital ID projects. One of the things that becomes most pertinent after Pfizer's public admission that they never tested, and a lot of people in the chat saying, I bet they did test, and that the clinical trial showed that, that it was potentially negative or unhelpful. One of the things that becomes immediately obvious is people not being able to travel because they're not vaccinated. That's pointless. The suggestion that people should have vaccine passports, that's pointless, unless, of course, you consider that that in itself was introduced in order to ease the way for forms of social credit control. And even if it's not as nefarious as that, the more ability you have to surveil and control a population, the better it is for the state, the better it is for the corporate state more broadly. So listen, Doc, we're going to have you on more. We'll talk to you. You don't have to squeeze it all in at once. You can just put them in one finger at a time, is what I will say. Yeah, Doctor, we'll be checking out your work. Is there anything you want to end on, just as a glorious goodbye to us?
People should be reassured. Even Joe Biden has said the pandemic is over. Omicron that's circulating now is no worse than a bad cold or the flu. So if there's a time to pause the vaccine, it's now, and people should be reassured by it.
That's nice, isn't it? That's reassuring. Well, a lovely bit of reassurance from a doctor. Dr. Aseem, we'll talk to you again soon. I hope it goes well next week for you in Parliament. Okay, hey, do you know that every single